Rome, in the time before Julius Caesar was born, was a city of slow rhythms and deep traditions. It was a place where the morning began with the quiet creak of wooden shutters being pushed open, where the smell of bread baking in stone ovens drifted through narrow streets before the sun had fully risen above the hills. The city sat along the Tiber River, which moved gently through the landscape, carrying small boats and reflecting the pale light of early mornings. Rome was not yet the vast empire it would one day become. It was a republic, governed by traditions that had been passed down across many generations, shaped by the slow accumulation of custom and habit and the quiet consensus of men who believed deeply in the way things had always been done. The hills of Rome were covered in buildings that ranged from grand stone temples to modest homes made of wood and clay brick. The streets between them were narrow, often winding in ways that made no particular geometric sense, having grown organically over centuries as people simply walked where it was easiest to walk. There were fountains fed by aqueducts that brought water down from distant hills, and these fountains were gathering places in the early morning, where people came to collect water for the day and exchange quiet words with their neighbors. The sounds of the city were layered and gentle in those early hours, the low murmur of conversation, the soft padding of sandaled feet on stone, the occasional sound of a cart being wheeled along a cobbled lane. It was into this world that Gaius Julius Caesar was born, most likely in the month of July, in a year that the Romans counted as close to the 100th year before the Common Era began. His family, the Julii, were among the old families of Rome, those whose ancestry stretched back into the earliest days of the city's history. They claimed descent from Iulus, the son of Aeneas, who was himself said to be the son of the goddess Venus. This lineage was something the family held quietly but with a deep sense of dignity. It did not make them the wealthiest family in Rome, nor the most politically powerful in those particular years, but it gave them a kind of rootedness, a sense of belonging to Rome in the most fundamental way. Caesar's childhood home was in a neighborhood called the Subura, which was one of the older, denser parts of the city. It sat in a valley between two of Rome's famous hills, and it was a neighborhood of ordinary life, shopkeepers and craftsmen, families going about their days in the particular rhythm that had defined Roman life for generations. The buildings here were close together, and the streets were shaded for much of the day by the upper floors of homes that leaned slightly toward one another. It was a neighborhood that smelled of cooking and fresh bread and the clean mineral scent of water from nearby fountains. It was not a grand neighborhood, but it was a living one, full of the gentle texture of daily human existence. As a child, Caesar would have grown up surrounded by the sounds and sights of this part of the city. He would have heard Latin spoken in its everyday form, not the formal ceremonial language of temples and government buildings, but the relaxed, comfortable speech of people calling to one another across a street, of vendors describing their wares, of neighbors discussing the small matters of a shared life. He would have seen the way Roman families organized themselves around the home, which was called the domus, and which was considered the true center of Roman life. The home was a place of routine and warmth, where the family gathered each morning to acknowledge the household gods, small figures kept in a particular corner of the main room, representing the protective spirits that Romans believed watched over the family's well-being. Roman children in this period spent their early years close to home, learning first from their parents and then, as they grew older, from tutors or small schools that might be held in a covered walkway or a quiet room off a public space. The curriculum that young Roman boys of good family followed was broad and unhurried. They learned to read and write Latin first, practicing the shapes of letters on wax tablets that could be smoothed over and used again, which meant that learning had a certain forgiving quality. A mistake could simply be pressed away, and the surface would be ready for another attempt. They learned the rudiments of arithmetic, working with numbers in the Roman system, which was used for counting and record-keeping throughout the city. As they progressed in their studies, boys like Caesar would have been introduced to Greek, which was considered an essential language for any educated Roman. Greece had been absorbed into the Roman world, but its culture, its philosophy, its literature, and its language retained enormous prestige. To speak and read Greek fluently was a mark of refinement, and Roman families who could afford it ensured their sons had Greek tutors. Caesar would have read the great Greek writers, encountered the ideas of Greek philosophers, and developed a familiarity with a tradition of thought that valued careful reasoning and the examination of what it meant to live a good life. This education was absorbed slowly, over years, in the way that genuine learning tends to accumulate, not all at once but in layers, each new piece of knowledge resting on what had come before. The Rome of Caesar's childhood was a city undergoing gradual change, as cities always do across time. The Republic had been in existence for several centuries, and its institutions had grown elaborate and in some ways rigid. The Senate, which was the body of senior Roman men who advised and governed, met in a building in the Forum, which was the large open space at the heart of the city. The Forum was surrounded by temples and public buildings, and it served as the center of Roman civic life, the place where legal matters were debated, where important announcements were made, where the texture of political life could be felt most directly. Citizens gathered there during the day to conduct business, to listen to speeches, to watch the slow ceremonial processes of Roman governance unfold. The Roman calendar was organized around a series of religious festivals and civic observances that marked the passing of the year with a kind of gentle regularity. There were festivals dedicated to various gods, each with its own particular customs, some involving processions through the streets, others involving offerings at temples, others still involving games or communal feasts. These occasions gave the year a rhythm, a sense of the months having distinct characters, of time moving not in an undifferentiated flow but in a sequence of recognized moments. For a child growing up in Rome, these festivals would have been some of the most memorable occasions of the year, times when the city dressed itself differently, when the smells and sounds of ordinary life were overlaid with something more ceremonial and celebratory. Caesar's father, also named Gaius Julius Caesar, was a man involved in the ordinary business of Roman political life at a modest level. He held positions in Roman administration and would have moved through the slow, careful progression of offices that characterized the career of a Roman man of good family. He died when Caesar was still a young man, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, and this loss reshaped the household in the way that such losses always do, quietly but completely, redistributing responsibilities and requiring new arrangements to be made. Caesar's mother, Aurelia, was by all accounts a woman of considerable intelligence and capability, and she took on the central role in managing the family and overseeing her son's continued education and development. Aurelia is remembered in later Roman writings as a particularly thoughtful and disciplined woman, someone who took seriously the task of raising her son well. She is described as having been closely involved in his education, not simply delegating that responsibility to tutors but remaining attentive to what he was learning and how he was developing. The relationship between a Roman mother and her son was considered deeply important, and in households where the father was absent, the mother's influence became even more pronounced. Caesar would have spent much of his formative time in his mother's company, absorbing her ways of thinking and her values, and the calm practicality she seemed to embody. The Roman household, at the level of a family like the Julii, would have included a small number of household slaves, which was a feature of Roman life that touches on the uncomfortable realities of that ancient world. Slavery was deeply woven into Roman society at every level, from the grandest aristocratic houses to modest family homes. The slaves who worked in a household like Caesar's would have been involved in cooking, cleaning, running errands, and various other domestic tasks. Some would have been educated and served as tutors or secretaries. The relationship between Roman families and their household slaves was complex and varied, but it was an omnipresent feature of daily life that a child growing up in Rome would have known simply as part of the texture of existence. As Caesar moved into his teenage years, the question of his future began to take on a more concrete shape. Roman men of good family followed a recognizable path, beginning with education, then moving into a period of public service that might include both military and civic roles, and gradually building the record of offices and achievements that constituted a Roman career. The specific path was called the cursus honorum, meaning roughly the course of honors, and it laid out a sequence of offices, from the most junior to the most senior, through which an ambitious Roman man was expected to progress. The system was orderly and gradual, valuing experience and seniority, moving men through positions in a way that was designed to accumulate knowledge and demonstrate reliability over time. Before embarking fully on this path, however, Caesar found himself caught up in one of the political upheavals of his time. Rome in the late Republic was a place of gradual but real political tension, as different factions within the Roman elite competed for influence and advantage. Caesar's family had connections to a powerful general and politician named Gaius Marius, who had reformed the Roman army and exercised great influence in the city. Through these family connections, the young Caesar found himself on a particular side of Roman political life, associated with those who were skeptical of the old aristocratic families who had dominated the Senate for generations. Another powerful figure of this period, a general named Sulla, represented a different set of interests and eventually seized control of Rome through military means, establishing a temporary dominance that reshaped who held power in the city. During this period of uncertainty, Caesar navigated carefully. He had been designated for a priestly role as Flamen Dialis, which was a prestigious but highly constrained position associated with the worship of Jupiter, king of the Roman gods. The position would have required him to follow an elaborate set of ritual restrictions. He could not touch iron, could not see an army drawn up for battle, could not spend more than 3 consecutive nights outside Rome, and many other detailed prohibitions that would have significantly limited his freedom of movement and action. The political changes under Sulla's influence meant that this appointment was rescinded, which, while perhaps disappointing in one sense, ultimately freed Caesar from those restrictions and left him with more flexibility for the kind of career he would eventually pursue. Sulla, during his period of dominance, had placed Caesar on a list of those he considered potentially problematic, associated as Caesar was with Marius's faction. Caesar left Rome for a time, moving through parts of Italy and then traveling east, which gave him his first extended experience of the wider Roman world beyond the city itself. This period of being away from Rome was not entirely comfortable, but it had a quality of quiet education about it, the experience of seeing different places, moving through different landscapes, encountering the ways that Roman influence and culture had spread through the Italian peninsula and beyond. Travel in the ancient world was slow and gave a traveler time to observe and absorb, to notice the way a landscape changed gradually as one moved through it, the way the vegetation and the architecture and the quality of the light shifted from one region to another. When Sulla's dominance eventually faded, the man died of natural causes, and his particular arrangements for Rome began to loosen. Caesar was able to return to the city. He was now in his early 20s, the time when a young Roman man of his background would begin in earnest the process of building a public career. He began to speak in the law courts, which was a common way for ambitious young Romans to make their names known. The law courts of Rome were public spaces, and legal cases were argued before audiences of citizens who came to watch and listen. A skilled speaker could make a significant impression, not just on the judges or juries but on the assembled public, and the reputation gained in these venues could open doors to more formal positions in Roman government. Caesar's speaking abilities seem to have developed steadily during this period. Roman oratory was a highly cultivated art, governed by elaborate rules and traditions about how a speech should be structured, what emotional registers it should move through, how the body should be used to reinforce the spoken words. The great orators of Rome were celebrated figures, their speeches discussed and analyzed long after they were delivered. To be an effective speaker was to possess one of the most valued skills in Roman public life, and Caesar devoted serious attention to developing this capacity. He traveled at one point to the island of Rhodes, which was known as a center of rhetorical study, to work with teachers there and refine his skills further. This journey, too, would have been an experience of gradual travel across the Mediterranean, of watching the sea change color as the light shifted, of arriving in different ports and observing the particular character of each place. Rhodes in this period was a prosperous and cultured island, its city built on hillsides above a harbor where ships came and went with the slow regularity that characterized maritime commerce in the ancient world. The teachers of rhetoric on Rhodes were respected throughout the Mediterranean world, and the island had a tradition of welcoming students from Rome and elsewhere who wished to deepen their education. Caesar's time there would have been spent in concentrated study, listening to instruction, practicing the composition and delivery of speeches, reading and discussing texts. It was the kind of sustained, focused educational experience that leaves an impression on a person not just in the specific skills acquired but in a broader way of approaching problems and ideas. Returning to Rome, Caesar resumed his progress through the lower rungs of Roman public life. He held a position as military tribune, which was an early step in the traditional Roman career. He served as quaestor, a financial and administrative role that took him to the province of Hispania Ulteria, the Roman territories in what is now Spain. This was his first experience of provincial administration, of governing a territory far from Rome, of dealing with the particular challenges of maintaining Roman order and collecting revenues in a place where conditions were very different from the city. Provincial service was an important part of a Roman official's experience, offering a kind of practical education in governance that could not be gained from any amount of reading or courtroom practice. The province of Hispania Ulterior was a region of varied landscapes, coastal areas with warm, dry summers, inland territories of plains and hills, mountain ranges that separated different ecological zones. The Roman presence there had been established for well over a century by this point, and the province had developed a particular character, blending Roman administrative forms with the cultures of the indigenous peoples who had lived there long before Roman influence arrived. For a Roman official arriving in such a place, there was always a process of orientation, of learning the specific circumstances of the territory, the particular personalities of the local leaders, the economic conditions that shaped what was possible and what was difficult. Caesar returned to Rome from this posting and continued moving through the expected sequence of Roman offices. He held the position of aedile, which carried responsibility for maintaining the city's public buildings and spaces, organizing games and public events, and overseeing various aspects of urban life. This was a role with considerable visibility. The aedile was responsible for things the Roman public could see and experience directly, and a capable aedile who managed these responsibilities well and organized impressive public events could gain significant goodwill from the populace. Caesar approached this role with notable energy and thoroughness, and the impression he made through these activities was substantial. The games and public events that an aedile organized were an important part of Roman civic life. Rome had a tradition of public spectacle, theatrical performances, gladiatorial contests, wild animal displays, athletic competitions, that served social and political functions beyond mere entertainment. These events brought large numbers of citizens together in shared experience, creating moments of collective life that reinforced a sense of belonging to the Roman community. The organization of such events required logistical skill, financial management, and an understanding of what Romans of different backgrounds and tastes found appealing. Caesar seems to have possessed all of these capacities in good measure, and his time as aedile added meaningfully to his reputation. The daily life of Rome during Caesar's adult years had a particular texture that is worth resting in for a moment. The city woke early, as cities without artificial lighting tend to do, taking advantage of the natural light of morning before the heat of midday made outdoor activity less comfortable. Vendors set up their stalls in markets and along the streets, displaying produce and goods that had arrived in the city from the surrounding countryside and from more distant regions via the roads and the river. Roman roads, some of which were already ancient by Caesar's time, connected Rome to every corner of the Italian peninsula and to the wider Mediterranean world, and goods flowed along these roads in a slow but constant stream, grain and olives and wine from various regions, wool and textiles, pottery and metalwork, all the material necessities and comforts of Roman life. The Roman Forum during daylight hours would have been a place of considerable activity, men meeting to discuss business and legal matters, politicians and advocates moving between buildings, citizens going about the various administrative transactions that Roman life required. The temples that stood around and near the Forum were not just religious spaces but also records offices, places where documents and treaties and public records were stored, reflecting the Roman understanding that the gods and the civic order were deeply intertwined. The sound of the Forum during a busy morning might have included multiple conversations happening simultaneously, the occasional raised voice of an orator practicing or arguing a case, the shuffle of feet on stone, the distant sound of hammering from construction that seemed always to be happening somewhere in the growing city. Roman houses of the middle and upper classes were organized around courtyards, open to the sky, which allowed light and air to circulate through the interior. The atrium, the central room of a Roman house, was a place where the family gathered and received visitors, and in many homes a small pool in the floor collected rainwater that fell through the opening in the roof above. Rooms opened off the atrium, and in larger houses, a further garden courtyard called the peristyle was located deeper in the structure, planted with herbs and flowers and providing a quiet, sheltered space for the household. The garden was a valued part of Roman domestic life, a place of relative quiet and greenery within the dense urban fabric. Food in Rome was grown, prepared, and consumed in patterns that reflected both the Mediterranean climate and the social structures of Roman society. Grain, particularly wheat, was the foundation of the Roman diet, consumed as bread or porridge in various forms. Olives and olive oil were essential, used in cooking and at the table, and the cultivation of olives throughout the Mediterranean world was in large part organized around supplying Roman needs. Wine, diluted with water, was the standard drink at meals. Undiluted wine was considered a sign of problematic habits, while the careful dilution of wine with water was understood as a mark of civilized moderation. Legumes, vegetables, fish, and occasionally meat rounded out a diet that varied considerably depending on one's position in Roman society. As Caesar continued his career, he developed a reputation not just for effectiveness as a public official but for a certain quality of personal engagement, the ability to remember names and faces, to make individuals feel that their concerns had been heard and acknowledged, to speak and write with a clarity and directness that people found appealing. These qualities, which seem to have been genuine aspects of his character rather than purely calculated performances, served him well in the gradual work of building political support. Roman politics at this level was intensely personal. It relied on networks of obligation and friendship, on the accumulated trust of many individual relationships, on being known and trusted by a wide range of people from senators to ordinary citizens. Caesar moved through further stages of his political career, holding the position of Pontifex Maximus, which was the highest religious office in Rome, responsible for overseeing the college of priests and maintaining the proper performance of the religious rites that the Romans believed kept the gods favorable. This position carried considerable prestige and also a degree of practical influence, as religious authority intersected in numerous ways with civic and political life. The Pontifex Maximus had an official residence in the Forum itself, a dignified house associated with the sacred character of the office, and Caesar moved his household there upon assuming the position. He also served as praetor, another step in the cursus honorum, which involved judicial and administrative responsibilities within the city. Each of these offices added to his experience and his visibility, and the network of people who had observed him work, who had seen him handle complex situations with patience and clarity, continued to grow. Roman careers were built slowly, over decades, through the accumulation of exactly this kind of experience and the relationships that came with it. The system was designed to produce men who had been tested in multiple contexts before being entrusted with the greatest responsibilities, and Caesar was working through that system with a steadiness and effectiveness that gradually set him apart. His personal life during these years also took shape in the ways that Roman family life was organized. He had married Cornelia, the daughter of a significant political figure, when he was a young man, and their relationship lasted until her death, which came relatively early in their married life. Their union had produced a daughter, Julia, who was the only child Caesar is known to have had, and she was a figure of considerable affection in his life. After Cornelia's death, Caesar married again, and then again. Roman marriage among the elite was often bound up with political alliance and social calculation, but the bonds formed in these marriages also carried genuine human weight. The Rome that Caesar inhabited was a city whose physical character was slowly being shaped and reshaped by the ambitions and resources of its leading men. The tradition of wealthy Romans adorning the city with public buildings and monuments was well established. It was understood as a form of generosity toward the community and also as a way of leaving a lasting mark. Temples were renovated and newly built. The road network was extended and improved. The port infrastructure that brought goods into the city was periodically expanded. The aqueduct system, which was a remarkable achievement of Roman engineering, carried water from sources many miles away into the city through channels that maintained a remarkably consistent gradient over long distances, allowing water to flow by gravity alone. Walking through Rome in this period, one would have been surrounded by visible evidence of this ongoing investment in the city's physical fabric. The Roman sense of civic identity was strong and carefully maintained. Citizens of Rome, and the question of who exactly qualified as a Roman citizen was one that evolved considerably across the period of the Republic, had a particular relationship with the city and its institutions. They had the right to vote, to participate in certain legal proceedings, to access the protections that Roman law provided. The gradual extension of Roman citizenship to more people across the Italian peninsula was one of the significant social processes of this era, a slow broadening of who was included in the formal Roman community. Caesar, throughout his career, showed a consistent interest in this kind of inclusiveness, in extending the boundaries of who belonged to Rome, and this tendency would become more pronounced as his responsibilities grew. In his late 30s, Caesar received an appointment as governor of the Roman provinces in Gaul, the territories that are now roughly equivalent to southern France and parts of Switzerland, and this posting marked the beginning of a new phase in his life. The appointment gave him command of several legions and responsibility for a vast territory. Provincial governorships of this kind were the setting in which Roman careers either made a great advance or stagnated, depending on how the governor handled the endless practical challenges of administration, revenue collection, maintaining order, and managing relations with neighboring peoples. The legions under Caesar's command in Gaul were composed of professional soldiers who had signed on for many years of service. The Roman army of this period was a remarkable institution, highly trained, organized according to a detailed structure of units and ranks, capable of sustained operations across varied terrain and in varied weather. The legionaries were not just fighters but builders and engineers. They constructed the roads, bridges, and fortifications that allowed Roman military power to project itself across great distances. A Roman legion on the march left behind it an infrastructure of campsites and roads that represented an enormous collective effort. The years that Caesar spent in Gaul were years of gradual expansion of Roman presence and influence across a large part of Western Europe. The territory was inhabited by various Celtic peoples who had their own long-established cultures, languages, religious practices, and political structures. These peoples were not without sophistication. They had been engaged in trade with the Mediterranean world for centuries, had developed impressive metalworking and agricultural traditions, and had political structures that varied from relatively centralized chieftainships to more dispersed tribal confederations. The process by which Roman authority spread through these territories was gradual and complex, involving negotiation and alliance as much as any other approach, and Caesar navigated these complexities through years of patient attention to the specific circumstances of each situation. The landscape of Gaul, what Caesar and his contemporaries called it, was one of great variety. There were the warm, dry regions of the south, where Roman influence had already been present for decades, where Latin was spoken in the towns and Roman administrative forms had taken root. Moving north and west, the landscape changed. The rivers grew larger, the forests denser, the climate cooler and wetter. There were regions of open plain where visibility extended far in every direction, and regions of thick woodland where the paths were narrow and the light filtered down in shifting patterns through the canopy above. The Rhine River formed a significant natural boundary in the east, its broad, slow waters carrying the boundary between the world that Caesar was administering and the territories beyond that remained outside Roman reach. During these years of extended service in the provinces, Caesar continued to write, a habit that remained consistent across his life. He wrote dispatches and reports to Rome, official communications that kept the Senate informed of events in the provinces. He also wrote two works that have survived to the present day, his accounts of the Gallic campaigns and a later account of a period of Roman civil conflict. These writings are remarkable for their clarity and directness. They are written in the third person, which gives them a certain calm, observational quality, Caesar writing about himself as if describing the actions of another person, with a kind of steady analytical composure. The sentences are not ornate or elaborate. They move forward with a clean, unhurried rhythm, giving information without embellishment, describing landscapes and situations and decisions with a precision that reflects a mind accustomed to careful observation. The writing style that comes through in these works is consistent with what other sources say about Caesar's character: a preference for clarity over complexity, an appreciation for direct communication, a tendency to cut away the unnecessary and work with what was essential. These qualities served him well in administrative contexts, where the ability to understand a situation quickly and respond to it with clear instructions was genuinely valuable. They also seem to have been qualities that the people around him found appealing and reassuring, the sense that here was a man who saw things plainly and would tell you what he saw without disguise or confusion. Back in Rome, during the periods when Caesar returned from his provincial duties, the city continued its own slow transformation. The population of Rome had grown considerably across the centuries of the Republic, and the city was denser and more complex than it had been in earlier generations. The neighborhoods of the city each had their own character, the commercial areas near the Forum with their sense of busy transactionality, the quieter residential neighborhoods on the hills where the wealthier families had their larger houses, the dense and lively neighborhoods in the valleys where ordinary Romans lived in apartment buildings several stories tall, called insulae, which were the characteristic residential form for most of the city's population. The insulae were structures of considerable ingenuity, stacking housing vertically in a way that made use of limited urban land. The lower floors, which were more accessible and less affected by the difficulty of carrying water and supplies upstairs, were more comfortable and consequently more expensive to rent. The upper floors were less desirable, but they offered the only affordable housing for the large numbers of people who came to Rome seeking work and opportunity. Life in these buildings was communal in many ways. Neighbors shared courtyards and water sources, and the proximity of daily life meant that people knew each other's routines and rhythms in some detail. The markets of Rome were important social spaces as well as economic ones. The Forum Boarium, near the river, was the old cattle market, and the Forum Holitorium was the vegetable market. There were fish markets and bread markets and markets for cloth and pottery and all the other goods that a large urban population required. Shopping in these markets was a daily activity for most Romans, who lacked the refrigeration that would have made bulk purchasing practical, and who instead bought what was needed for each day's meals in a rhythm of regular small transactions. The vendors who worked these markets were part of the daily social fabric, and the regulars who bought from them over years developed the easy, comfortable familiarity that comes from frequent repeated contact. The Tiber River that ran along the western edge of the city was both a practical resource and a constant presence in Roman life. Goods arrived at Rome's river docks, the Emporium, in boats that had come from the port of Ostia at the river's mouth, carrying grain from Egypt and North Africa, wine and oil from Spain and Greece and the islands of the Mediterranean, marble from various quarries, and all the other materials that Rome's enormous appetite for goods required. The docks were busy through much of the day, and the neighborhood around them had the character that port districts everywhere tend to develop, a kind of rough practicality, full of warehouses and workers, with the smell of the river and the damp stone and the accumulated goods of many regions mingling in the air. Roman religious life permeated daily existence in ways that are somewhat different from how religion is organized in most modern contexts. The gods of Rome were numerous and varied, each associated with particular domains of life: the sea, the harvest, love, war, the home, commerce, medicine, and many others. Romans did not typically choose a single god to worship exclusively, but rather engaged with the divine as a complex, differentiated field, offering prayers and sacrifices to whatever deity was most relevant to a current concern. There were the great state temples where public religious ceremonies were conducted on behalf of the whole Roman people, and there were the small household shrines where daily acknowledgement of the protective spirits of the home took place, and between these two poles there was a rich middle ground of neighborhood shrines, professional associations with their patron deities, and personal devotions that varied from family to family. The Roman calendar, organized in part around religious observances, gave the year a texture of recurring occasions, some solemn, some festive, some serving primarily as occasions for communities to come together. The Saturnalia, held in mid-December, was one of the best known of these occasions, a period of loosened social conventions and festive giving, associated with the god Saturn and with the memory of a mythological golden age when distinctions of rank and condition were less fixed. During the Saturnalia, it was customary to exchange small gifts and for households to relax some of their normal hierarchical arrangements. This festival had a warmth about it that seems to have made it genuinely popular across different levels of Roman society. As Caesar's career continued to develop and his influence in Roman affairs grew, Rome itself continued to be a place of slow but real change. The city was in some ways straining against the institutions that had governed it during a period when it was smaller and less complex. The Republic had been designed for a city-state with a particular scale of concerns, and as Rome had grown into the center of a vast Mediterranean world, the adequacy of its traditional governmental forms had increasingly come into question. This was not primarily a question that anyone in Rome experienced as an abstract philosophical puzzle. It was experienced as a practical reality, the difficulty of governing distant territories, of managing an army that was continuously in the field, of making decisions quickly enough to deal with situations that arose thousands of miles from the city. Caesar returned to Rome from his years in Gaul with an enhanced reputation and a loyal army of veterans who had served with him for years. His relationship with his soldiers was one of the notable features of his leadership. He seems to have taken a genuine interest in their well-being, to have shared the physical hardships of campaigning, to have known individual soldiers by name across the legions. This relationship of trust and mutual regard was not simply a calculated political strategy, though it certainly served political purposes. It seems to have been grounded in a genuine appreciation of what the soldiers did and what they endured, and they responded to it with a loyalty that was personal as well as institutional. The city he returned to was one that he knew deeply, having grown up in it and spent much of his adult life in its particular rhythms. The Forum was familiar, the temples and public buildings carrying the weight of memories and associations accumulated across a lifetime. The neighborhoods of the city each had their own feel and their own communities, and moving through Rome meant moving through layers of familiarity that only long residence creates. Caesar knew the social landscape of the city, which families were allied with which, where the various factions of Roman political life had their centers of gravity, how the informal networks of obligation and friendship and rivalry that governed so much of Roman public life were actually arranged. His presence in the city as a man of considerable achievement and resources made a visible difference. He undertook building projects that added to the city's physical fabric, contributing to the tradition of powerful Romans investing in the common spaces that all citizens shared. He engaged with the legal and political processes of the city in his characteristic direct way, addressing the matters that came before the governing institutions with a combination of patience and decisiveness. The Senate, which was the traditional center of Roman governance, was a body of several hundred men with their own histories, alliances, and views about how Rome should be managed, and navigating this body required a steady willingness to engage with its procedures and its personalities. The Roman day, for a man of Caesar's position and responsibilities, would have begun early. Romans of consequence typically received visitors in the morning, a practice called the salutatio, in which clients, people who had some relationship of obligation or connection to the powerful man, would come to pay their respects and conduct their business. The morning hours were busy with these encounters, each brief, each carrying its own particular matter that needed to be heard and responded to. After this, the day moved into its public phases, appearances in the Forum, attendance at the Senate when it was meeting, legal and administrative matters of various kinds, the constant stream of correspondence that connected Rome to its provinces and to the wider Roman world. Writing was central to Roman public life in ways worth noting. Letters were the primary means of communication across distance, carried by messengers along the Roman road network. Important letters were written on wax tablets for quick drafting and then transferred to papyrus for final versions that would be sent. Caesar was a prolific and capable writer, and his correspondence with people throughout the Roman world kept him informed and connected even during long periods of absence from Rome. The letters he received would have carried news from every direction, from senatorial contacts in the city, from governors in distant provinces, from friends and allies across the Mediterranean world, from family members managing the various domestic matters of an extended household. Papyrus, on which much Roman writing was done, came primarily from Egypt, which was perhaps the single most important source of papyrus in the ancient world. The plant grew in abundance along the Nile, and its processing into writing material was a significant industry. The finished papyrus was shipped throughout the Mediterranean, and its availability in Rome, where it arrived in rolls that could be cut and used as needed, was taken for granted by the literate population. The Romans also used wooden tablets coated with wax for temporary notes and quick correspondence, a more immediately available and less expensive material that could be reused many times before the wood wore out. The libraries of Rome, some private and some attached to temples or public spaces, were important resources for the educated Romans of this period. Books, papyrus rolls containing copied texts, were produced by workshops that employed literate slaves to copy manuscripts, allowing texts to be reproduced and distributed to those who wished to own them. The price of a book varied considerably depending on its length and the quality of the copying, but for men of means, building a private library was both a practical resource and a mark of cultural seriousness. Caesar, with his deep education in both Latin and Greek literature, would have had access to the texts of his tradition and would have continued reading throughout his adult life. Philosophy, which had entered Rome primarily through the influence of Greek thought, was a subject that many educated Romans engaged with seriously. The Stoic school was particularly influential in Rome. Its emphasis on reason, on the acceptance of what could not be changed, on finding an inner stability that was not dependent on external circumstances, resonated with something in the Roman character. Epicurean philosophy, which emphasized a quiet and moderate life aimed at avoiding pain and finding gentle pleasures, also had its Roman adherents. These philosophical traditions were not merely abstract intellectual exercises for those who engaged with them. They offered practical guidance for how to live, how to respond to difficulty, how to think about one's place in a larger order of things. The question of how Rome itself was ordered, the relationship between its institutions, its traditions, and the realities of power, was one that became more pressing across the years of Caesar's life. The Republic had never been entirely stable. There had been periods of significant tension and conflict throughout its history. But the particular strains of this era, as the scale of Roman power had grown far beyond what the original institutions had been designed to manage, gave these tensions a new quality. The Senate remained the traditional center of authority, but the generals who commanded Rome's armies and administered its provinces had resources and loyalties that were in some ways independent of senatorial control, and the relationship between senatorial authority and military power was never entirely resolved within the framework of republican institutions. Caesar occupied a central position in these unresolved tensions, not because he went looking for conflict but because his career brought him to a point where the question of how his achievements would be recognized within the existing system became genuinely difficult. The arrangements he had made with other powerful men of his time, the informal alliances and understandings that characterized Roman political life at the highest level, had over time created both possibilities and constraints, and navigating these required the same patient attention to the specifics of each situation that had characterized his earlier career. He found himself, in the final years of the Republic, in Rome as the city's most prominent figure, working through the business of governing as he had always done, attending to the practical details of administration, engaging with the people who came to him with questions and requests, managing the enormous correspondence that connected him to every part of the Roman world. His days retained the structure that Roman life imposed, the early morning receptions, the afternoon rest that Romans customarily took during the hottest part of the day, the evening meals that were the primary social occasion of the Roman day. The evening meal in a Roman household of means was a social event that could last several hours. Guests reclined on couches arranged around a central table, a posture that marked the meal as a formal occasion rather than a quick necessity. Food arrived in courses, beginning with lighter dishes and moving through to more substantial ones, accompanied by wine diluted to various strengths according to the preferences of the host. Conversation was a central part of the meal, informed, ranging discussion of public affairs, literary and philosophical topics, the various matters of Roman life, conducted with a kind of leisurely engagement that reflected the importance Romans placed on conversation as an art and a pleasure. The table conversation of educated Romans would have moved through topics with the easy transitions of people accustomed to broad-ranging discussion. A comment on a legal matter before the courts might lead to a reflection on a passage in a Greek philosopher's text, which might lead to a discussion of conditions in a particular province, which might lead to thoughts on Roman religious practice or the current state of the grain supply. The world that educated Romans inhabited was one where these different domains were not strictly separated, where law and philosophy and religion and economics all touched on each other as aspects of a single, unified civic life. As the months and years of this final period of Caesar's public life passed, Rome was slowly changing its character in ways that were partly the result of his presence and partly the result of larger forces that no single person had set in motion. He proposed changes to the calendar. The old Roman calendar had drifted out of alignment with the solar year, and Caesar, drawing on the expertise of an Egyptian astronomer, developed a reformed calendar that added an extra day every 4 years to maintain alignment. This reform was a characteristic product of his combination of practical concern and attention to detail, recognizing a problem that had accumulated gradually and addressing it with a straightforward solution that would serve the city for generations. He undertook the foundation of new colonies in various parts of the Roman world, settlements that would carry Roman citizens to different regions and establish Roman cultural and administrative forms in new places. This was both a solution to the problem of a growing population in the city itself, providing land and opportunity for those who lacked it, and an extension of the Roman project of organizing the world according to Roman patterns. The colonies would grow into their own particular characters over time, shaped by the landscapes and peoples they were established among, but they would carry with them the Latin language, the Roman legal tradition, and the cultural habits that connected them to the city they had come from. The building projects that Caesar initiated in Rome were substantial in scale and reflected a clear vision of how the city should grow. He planned a new forum, an extension of the civic center that would provide more space for the administration of justice and the conduct of public business. He proposed a great library, imagining a public institution that would make the accumulated texts of Greek and Latin literature available to citizens who wished to read and study. He considered modifications to the course of the Tiber to reduce the flooding that periodically disrupted the lower parts of the city. These plans, some of which he lived to begin and others of which remained unrealized, reflected a mind that thought about Rome not just as it was but as it could be, as a physical environment that could be organized more thoughtfully and more beautifully than what had grown up through the accumulated choices of many generations. The Rome he saw when he looked at it with this kind of attention was a city of remarkable vitality and impressive achievement, but also of considerable disorder. The narrow streets, having grown without overall planning, created difficulties for the movement of goods and people. The housing for much of the population was crowded and sometimes poorly maintained. The public spaces, while impressive in many areas, were unevenly distributed across the city's various neighborhoods. The infrastructure, roads, water supply, waste management, was impressive in some respects but strained by the sheer scale of the urban population. A city of perhaps 1 million people was an unprecedented thing in the ancient world, and Rome had grown to that scale without any framework of planning adequate to it. His attention to these practical matters of urban life was consistent with the character that ran through everything he did, a preference for looking at things as they actually were and responding to what he found rather than to what might be conventionally said or assumed. This quality of direct, honest attention to reality, whatever its inconveniences, seems to have been fundamental to how he moved through the world. It showed in his writing, in the plain clarity with which he described terrain and circumstances and decisions. It showed in his administration, in the willingness to address problems that had been allowed to accumulate because no one wanted the difficulty of dealing with them. The final chapter of his life, which came in the early spring of a year that Romans counted as the 710th year of their city, arrived in the way that endings in actual lives tend to arrive, not as the culmination of a clear narrative arc but as an interruption of the ongoing business of living. Caesar was, in those months, still working, still attending to the enormous range of administrative and political matters that constituted governance, still planning the projects and expeditions that reflected his sense of what Rome needed to do next, still meeting the endless stream of people who came with their questions and requests and concerns. The city in those early spring days would have been beginning to wake from winter. The days were growing longer, the light having the soft quality of a Mediterranean late winter moving into spring, the air still cool but carrying intimations of warmth to come. The flowers that grew in Roman gardens and along the roads would have been beginning to emerge, the particular plants of the Italian spring, anemones and wild cyclamen, and the small yellow flowers that spread across the hillsides in early March. The birds that had been absent through the colder months were returning, and their voices in the morning added a gentle thread of sound to the city's lead acoustics. Rome itself, in those final days of February and early March, went about its business with the ordinary rhythm of a city that did not know it was living through a moment that would be remembered across 20 centuries. The markets opened in the morning, the bread was baked and sold, the legal proceedings in the courts followed their procedures, children went to their tutors, workers made their way to the construction sites and workshops where Rome was always, somewhere, being built or rebuilt or maintained. The Tiber moved through the city as it always did, carrying its quiet traffic, its surface reflecting the light of a spring sky. And Caesar himself, in those final ordinary days, was what he had always been, a man doing the work that had accumulated across a long career of engaging with the world as he found it, using the intelligence and attention and calm persistence that had characterized his approach from his earliest days in the Subura neighborhood, through his education and his early career, through the years of provincial service and the return to Rome, through all the complexity of the Republic's final years, too. This moment in early spring when the city was beginning to flower and the day's business was once again before him. The story of Julius Caesar is, at its deepest level, the story of a person who paid attention, who noticed things, about people, about places, about the way situations were actually organized as distinct from how they were described, who responded to what he noticed with a steadiness and clarity that made complex things manageable, who built relationships across decades of genuine engagement with the particular people and places that constituted his world, who wrote about all of it with a directness that has kept those writings readable and instructive across the centuries. Rome, after his time, continued to change and grow and transform itself, as it had been doing for centuries before he was born. The city he had known, the narrow streets of the Subura where he had grown up, the forum where he had argued cases and attended the Senate, the temples and markets and fountains and courtyards that had constituted the physical setting of his daily existence, persisted for generations, slowly modified and added to and gradually overlaid with the constructions of later ages. The Latin language that he had spoken and written with such precision continued to be used for centuries more, and in its later forms it became the source of languages spoken by hundreds of millions of people today. The calendar he reformed, adding that small correction that keeps it aligned with the movements of the Earth around the Sun, is the ancestor of the calendar still used in most of the world. The months retain their Latin names, including the month of July, which was named for Caesar himself after his death, a quiet memorial in the form of a name given to 31 days that return each year with the warmth of a northern summer, carrying with them, in their name, the trace of a man who grew up in the streets of an ancient city and spent his life paying careful attention to the world he inhabited.